So it's an easy reading. It's one small section from this book. It's called the process of creating destruction. And what this is all about is a critique of the two models of competition that we studied last week. It's a critique of the models of price searcher and price taker market, and he calls them in the reading in this small chapter. He calls it imperfect competition, and perfect competition. He uses the terms that were used at that time. Perfect competition is the price taker, imperfect competition is the price searcher. Both of them are described in our previous analysis as essentially static forms of competition, which means that they assume an environment within which the competitive process is taking place is given and unchanging, which means that technology, products, and production techniques and the forms of business organization are all known and unchanging. Remember the discussion that the firm is a black box. It doesn't matter what is the internal structure of the firm, whether it changes or not, the management style and technique. The firm is just an entity that produces stuff, that takes in certain factors of production, raw materials, labor, and so on, capital, mixes them up, and then simply produces something and sells it on the market. It doesn't matter whether a firm is a corporation, whether a firm is small or big. In most cases, whether a firm is managed this or that way, it's considered to be just a black box. You don't look within the black box to see what's in there. You just look at it functional. The firm does what it does. It doesn't matter how it does it. And Schumpeter says you will see that it matters a lot how it does it and what is the internal structure of the firm and what are the mechanisms of managing the firm and so on. So these are the static conception of competition is the usual textbook model that Schumpeter criticizes. We also see that he criticizes the assumptions that the products are given. You cannot change them. And also that the competitiveness of the market is associated with the presence of a large number of firms. He also rejects that. He goes almost in the opposite extreme by saying actually that the monopoly is a precondition, monopolistic conditions, at least temporarily, monopolized markets are preconditions of true market efficiency. You will see on page 84, he has one interesting quotation, because most of you haven't read it. I'll take this opportunity just to read you some of the passages. Actually, what is really important in this entire book and in this section are a couple of quotations. That's one of the ironies of this situation. Joseph Schumpeter was a well-known economist who published his first great book about the business cycle and monetary policy when he was 25 or something, 1912. He published many good books, including the best, probably the best history of economic thought, history of economic analysis ever published, which was revolutionary in so many ways, including his proof in this book that the real founding fathers of economic science were Catholic theologians of the 16th century Spain, rather than celebrated Adam Smith, whom everybody considers to be the real founder of economic science. So he made great contributions in many areas of economic theory and history of economic thought. However, what he is most well known for is exactly this small section from a large book about capitalism, democracy, and socialism, in which he essentially argues that capitalism is much more efficient than socialism, but it will fail exactly because of that, because intellectuals hate capitalism. And socialism is going to triumph. That's something that about in 1944. Democracy will lead to the demise of capitalism because people don't understand the reasons for its efficiency, and intellectuals are at the forefront of propagandizing and evangelizing the masses against capitalism and for social control. It's a deeply dark and pessimistic book. He was for a free market, but he believed that there is no way capitalism will survive. Capitalism will fail exactly because of its superior efficiency and inability of majority of people to accept this. And this small chapter is maybe the best formulation that he developed about why capitalism is so good in creating material prosperity and improving the standard of living of the people. He starts his analysis, in a certain sense, by rejecting or contextualizing, let's say, this static concept of competition that we find in the textbooks, that were in the textbooks in 1940 already. I'll quote from page 84. It says, economists are at long last emerging from the stage in which price competition was all they saw. So for a long period of time, an imperfect competition was established in 1930s. So perfect competition, 1921, Frank Knight. Imperfect competition, mid-1930s, John Robinson and Cambridge theory. 1930s. Schumpeter writes 1944. So he says by 1940s, actually this theory of imperfect competition emphasizing price competition. You will remember that in the perfectly competitive model, you are not free to compete by lower prices. You accept prices, you take prices as given. Here, you compete by cutting prices. And also, what is the other way how you compete? Differentiating the product. Quality competition. He says, as soon as quality competition and sales efforts are admitted into the sacred precincts of theory, with this model here, the price variable is ousted from its dominant position. However, it is still, this is maybe the key, one of the key sentences, it is still competition within a rigid pattern of invariant conditions. That's what he says, both of these models. So competition within a rigid pattern of invariant conditions. What that means. That's a kind of fancy scholarly way of reformulating what I told you 5 or 6 times. Unchanging environment, given conditions. Invariant conditions, invariant methods of production, and forms of industrial organization. You see, both of these static models of competition assume that the methods of production and forms of industrial organization are given and unchanging. And now the key twist comes along. The very next sentence. He says, this is the picture that economists give us in their textbook treatments of competition. Competition is doing something with the prices and the quality, slight changes in the prices and qualities of already existing products produced by the existing production techniques that are not changing. There is no innovation. No innovation. Or very little, limited innovation in this model. Price taker or imperfect competition. But, the key, but, in capitalist reality, as distinguished from its textbook picture, it is not that kind of competition which counts. Not this fiddling with prices and quantities and quality of the product. But the competition from the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply, the new type of organization, all of these. Competition which commands a decisive cost or quality advantage and which strikes not at the margins of the profits and the outputs of the existing firms, but at their foundations and their very lives. How do you interpret this? How this competition in changing the forms of business organization and the methods of production and inventing new products, they don't strike at the margins of profit of the existing firms, but at their very lives, their very existence. How do you interpret this? It says this kind of competition is as much more effective than the other, this one, static, as a bombardment is in comparison with forcing a door. So the comparison is something so feeble and irrelevant, like forcing a door, and the real competition is like bombardment. This is almost the very definition of what we call creative destruction. The basic idea is that innovation both in the methods of production, in the type of product that is being sold, in the forms of business organization, that these innovations not only cut the profit margins of the existing firms, they destroy their existence. They make, by making their products obsolete, or by making their production techniques obsolete, or by making their forms of internal organization of the firm obsolete, not viable. I'll give you just one more quotation before I explain you a little bit further. There's the fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumer goods, the new methods of production or transportation, the new markets, the new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprise creates. As we have seen in the preceding chapter, the contents of the laborer's budget, say from 1760 to 1940, did not simply grow on unchanging lines, but they underwent a process of qualitative change. He means that what people buy, what people consume, didn't only increase quantitatively, that people are buying larger quantities of bread and milk and meat, and that's everything. Economic prosperity is not reflected only in the fact that people buy higher quantities of already existing products. New stuff is coming along based on industrial innovation. And he now says, similarly, just as the consumer change or increase in economic welfare of ordinary people is not reflected only in quantitative terms, by people buying more of the existing stuff, but also in qualitative terms, people buying different kinds of stuff. The same happens in the production, in the process of production. The history of the productive apparatus of a typical farm, from the beginnings of the rationalization of crop rotation, plowing and fattening, to the mechanized thing of today, is a history of revolutions. Not small changes in adjusting your quantity of produced stuff to the changes in prices, not cutting or increasing prices of already existing products, but revolution in the production techniques, or a series of revolutions. So one example that he mentions is the crop rotation. Anyone knows what is that? Your kids from an agricultural state, what is that?
Well, it could be rotating out different crops every so many years,
Yeah.
so that it doesn't deteriorate the soil.
So you're changing the culture that you're cultivating in order to preserve the richness of the soil. You know when was that invented? You might be surprised. Greeks and Romans didn't know crop rotation. The Babylonians and Chinese and Indians didn't know about it. Medieval Europe, 11th, 12th century, crop rotation is about 1,000 years. That's when that was an invention. Before that, the agriculture was highly inefficient, actually. It would destroy, it was environmentally disastrous, actually. You deplete one area and then you go further and you cut down the forest and you convert the forests into the arable land. So in the period of the Roman Republic and Roman Empire, actually, the forested area in Europe and Middle East was far lower than nowadays, because the agriculture demanded that you just keep expanding the arable land, because you destroy the soil very quickly, and then you have to find new land. Since medieval times, we discovered this idea of crop rotation that can protect the quality of the existing soil, so you don't have to expand as much in clearing the forest. You see, one seemingly small change leads to dramatic increase in economic productivity. It says, so is the history of the productive apparatus of the iron and steel industry, from the charcoal furnace to our own type of furnace, like the blast furnace. Or the history of the apparatus of power production from overshot water wheel to the modern power plant. Or the history of transportation from mail coach to the airplane. See, that's also a technological revolution that makes obsolete the previous problem. The opening up of new markets, foreign or domestic, and the organizational development from the craft shop and factory to such concerns as US Steel. So you see now forms of industrial organization also undergo revolutionary changes. You'll see the small craft shop or a medieval guild is one thing, one way of producing stuff, and modern corporation is something quite different. So all of these illustrate the same process of industrial mutation. He's now using biological terminology. Industrial mutation. It's a kind of Darwinian terminology. He's not talking, of course, about the evolution and mutation and change of biological organisms, but of the forms of production and business organization, from craft shop to corporation, from non-crop rotation to crop rotation, from working the land with hand tools to working the land with combine harvesters and tractors, from making steel with the charcoal primitive furnace to modern blast furnaces, and so on. And now maybe the key sentence, this is the industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. Blast furnace is invented, charcoal furnace is obsolete. Computer is invented, a new thing is created, typewriter is destroyed. That's the meaning of creative destruction. Creating new value, new products, new types of organization of business, new techniques of production, old techniques of production, old products, all forms of organization become obsolete, become destroyed. So that's the meaning of creative destruction. So economy is not a static given environment within which firms passively compete by just cutting or increasing prices or cutting or decreasing production. It's a kind of evolutionary Darwinian process of more successful forms surviving, less successful forms dying out. Stagecoach died out. Cars and airplanes survived. We are on the cusp of private firms disappearing, corporations survive. It's 95% of economic value is produced by corporations. Maria, you want to?
Yeah, I was wondering, so like overall, we see a lot of different changes, like you're saying, something new and better is made, and the other thing's obsolete. And for the most part, don't we see that as like a positive thing until we get to the point of like, oh well, our machines and technology going to take over positions that people could do. And like we do kind of see that as a negative thing, but
yeah.
I mean, would Schuster have anything to say about like whether or not that is like still this idea of like mutation sounds so negative?
Yeah. Do we have a bad genetic mutation that we eventually end up with an inferior organism? His answer is no. His answer here is that this industrial mutation undergoes the test of fittest organisms or fittest forms survive. And what is the standard of fitness? The ability to satisfy consumer needs at a lower price. The reason why cars and airplanes survive is not there is some grand conspiracy against the stagecoaches or horse and buggy industry, but because they can satisfy human need in a more efficient and economically less costly way. That's the explanation, which doesn't mean that we have to accept from a moral standpoint, the world in which airplanes fly. There are many people who are nostalgic for the past. There is a horse and buggy industry. People still like to drive stagecoaches and to live in some romantic landscapes of countryside and so on, to buy medieval estates. You have in the American South, people, one professor of English literature at the University of South Carolina, he bought some kind of mansion from colonial mansion, and he is now working the land in essentially the same way as people did in the 18th, 19th century, because he is an incorrigible romantic and he likes to live that way. So it doesn't mean that we all have to, on moral grounds, to accept economic progress as something desirable. But it means, in a more narrow economic sense, that the standard of living of ordinary people has been improved by this. And that the economic costs of these new inventions are lower than the economic costs of the previous ones. So always, economics value-free science. We don't make judgments whether it's better to fly by airplanes or not. Is it better to drive cars or not? To use computers or not? So majority of people probably prefer to use it, but it doesn't mean that everybody has to accept ethically this. So you see, illustrations of this. So America played a crucial role in many of these revolutions. So I mentioned some of the names that we might have mentioned here in class, illustrate some of the aspects of this process of creative destruction. I'll mention one name now for you, and you'll try and tell me what this person did in terms of creative destruction and in terms of revolutionary changes in America. Henry Ford. What's his contribution to the economic process? Yeah, assembly line. So what's the matter with the assembly line? Why assembly line was important? And how the invention of the assembly line fits the picture of creative destruction? So, brief description. What is the economic benefit of the assembly line? What is the economic justification? No.
They can get more done in a short period of time.
Yeah.
And like the workers, they cut their days like 8-hour days, and they can still get more done in an 8-hour day than like a 12-hour
So you
day.
get a much more efficient utilization of your workers' labor time, much less waste, better centralization of the production process, and huge cost savings in using your workers' labor time. Now, notice that Henry Ford didn't revolutionize automobile production in terms of new technological breakthroughs. So Henry Ford, the technology for car production was known before Henry Ford came along, and he didn't improve it greatly. And let's face it, I'm a new American, I'm hugely patriotic and pro-American, but American cars are not really good as compared to European and Asian cars. They're not so good even today. So Ford cars were not so much better. Mercedes cars were better in 1920s. But Henry Ford did something which you can produce the existing cars wherever they are much cheaper. That was his contribution. Not that he improved so much the technology and the characteristics of the product, he improved the method of production by inventing the assembly line. Let's say you can revolutionize competition in the field without changing the product at all. By changing the methods how the product is made, by discovering a new, more efficient, less costly way of producing something. And once that happens, everybody has to emulate Henry Ford. If you want to stay in the business, you better change your way, whatever the previous way of production was. Assembly line was universally accepted. So, you know, the whole manufacturing system of the economy that dominated the 20th century, you know what was the textbook economic name for that? Fordist economy. Under Henry Ford. The assembly line method of manufacturing stuff. It was applied not only in the automobile industry, in all walks of economic life. It made obsolete everything else. Now it's assembly line or you're dead. You might have devoted your entire life to some alternative method of production. Tough luck, sorry, but you cannot survive. It's a cruel world. So Ford didn't just kind of reduce price a little bit or competed maybe by slightly changing the design of the product. Quite the contrary. There was this famous advertisement from 1910s. You can buy our T model, the famous Ford T model, in any color as long as the color is black. For a long time, they didn't sell cars in any other color than black. So he didn't bother very much with that, with the technological innovation. Yet he revolutionized the automobile productions. Maybe more. He was the most influential businessman of the 20th century, probably, before the age of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and the new post-industrial society. The most influential, or maybe the second most influential, we'll see when we discuss the next guy whom I'm going to mention. Maybe the most influential in the 20th century was Henry Ford. Okay, another name, John D. Rockefeller. What did he do?
He bought up all the smaller oil companies.
Yeah, so he was the most influential businessman of the 19th century. This American spirit of innovation. So he was very influential in this aspect, the second aspect of the creative destruction revolution, changes in the forms of business organization. What he would do was actually, he was in the oil business. He was the founder of the Standard Oil of Ohio, the biggest oil firm in the United States and in the world in the late 19th century. So the business model before Rockefeller was that you have extraction business. That's the first stage of production. Firms extracting oil, crude oil, and selling it on the market to refineries. Refineries converting crude oil into saleable products like kerosene, gasoline, mazout, asphalt, and so on. And there's sending the product to distributional networks, gas stations, distribution networks that sell the product to final consumer. That was the business model, prevailing form of industrial organization before John D. Rockefeller. What he realized were two things. First thing, he realized as your firm grows bigger, you can sell at lower price. This is called economy of scale. Economies of scale. We are well familiar with this effect in modern society. This is why Walmart can afford to sell at cheaper prices than mom and pop shop. It's called economy of scale. Economy of scale means that as the value of your product, the volume of your production increases, your per unit costs of production decline. Which means that you can charge a lower per unit price if your size is bigger than if your size is smaller. So bigger firms have the competitive edge, competitive advantage. The 19th century was a period of extremely rapid industrialization of American society, and the big firms, huge firms, showed up for the first time. And Rockefeller understood very well the advantage of a large-scale production over a small-scale production. The second thing that he realized, actually, and that was the spark of genius, he said, this doesn't strike me as a particularly efficient way of organizing production of gasoline or kerosene as your final product. Because if you're a refinery, you depend on the extraction company, they can dictate they can blackmail you. So the costs of price negotiations and adjusting to the requirement of your buyers and your vendors are such that you lose a lot of energy, kind of similar to what Henry Ford realized in the context of industrial production itself. So he got an idea that you can unite, as William said, unify the entire vertical structure of production by buying up all your competitors at all three stages of the business. So he unified extraction, refining, and distribution network into one big business operation, which increased the size horizontal in terms of the size of the firm, but also increased its depth. Because now Standard Oil of Ohio was extracting crude oil, refining it, and distributing it, without the need to bother about the inter-firm negotiations about prices and quantities, blackmails, and all kinds of strategic games that different market agents can play. The result of that was a tremendous increase in oil production and a decrease in prices all the time. Throughout the late 19th century, ever since 1875-76 until about 1905, 1910. The market share of Standard Oil of Ohio was 95%, which means that out of total sales in kerosene, selling kerosene and oil products, Standard Oil was selling 90% of that total quantity. In the same time, the prices per unit were going down and down and down and down, 70% over a period of 34 years. Now, that was a revolution. That was an industrial mutation. Now, everybody who wanted to compete against Standard Oil had to adopt the same approach. And eventually, the monopoly, you know how the monopoly of Standard Oil was undercut. Who did it and how?
The government?
Yeah, the government broke up Standard Oil, but that was already after Standard Oil's market share fell to like 50-60%. They were already in the process. It was broken up eventually. You know which firm, by the way, is the descendant of Standard Oil of Ohio? It's still a very powerful oil company. ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is a Standard Oil of Ohio. And you see that the same model is you have a distributional network, you have gas stations all over Bismarck. Now, they do everything: drilling of crude oil, refining it, distributing. The John D. Rockefeller's method is still playing. Texaco and Texas business interests. They were much better in producing and much cheaper in producing and selling a new product that became popular at the turn of the century, gasoline. So John D. Rockefeller was a king of kerosene, but now when gasoline came along, the Texas business and southwestern oil business was better in doing that, and they was essentially undercut the monopolistic position of Standard Oil. So see, but the entire industry overnight has been transformed by this invention, and everybody knew that you had to vertically integrate to some degree if you want to exploit the advantages of economies of scale. So see, that's also competitive. mechanism. You don't have actually you're producing the same product. John D. Rockefeller did not develop any new technological breakthroughs either, just like Henry Ford. He did some of it because his main chemist, his main engineer was a very talented chemist. So there were some innovations, some products that used to be waste before Rockefeller, he transformed them into useful products, but not very much. The main contribution was in changing the industrial organization, the prevailing form of industrial organization. So that's competition as well. You organize your firm in a different way, not only your production techniques, but your internal organization. And you change fundamentally the entire industry. One more example for you. Corporation versus private firm. I have mentioned this already. So what is the basic difference between a corporation and a private firm? We'll talk much more about that. So 90 to 95% of economic value is produced by corporations. Yeah, that's one. So multiple owners, which are called stockholders or shareholders. So it's a public corporation, which means that you emit your shares on the stock market, the capital market, and people buy shares. People buy capital. People contribute capital directly to the firm by buying stocks, bonds. Whereas in a private firm, you save some money and you invest it, or maybe you borrow from a bank, but it's a closed society. You cannot exploit the advantages of capital market in a private firm. What else? Maybe the key difference. What is that? LTD. Limited liability. The concept of limited liability. What is that?
That the owner personally will not be held responsible for, like, if the firm.
For the debt.
Yeah.
For the debt of the firm beyond and above how much you invest. The only thing that you can lose are your shares.
Yeah.
If the firm goes bankrupt or is in debt, you may lose your money that you invested. But you're not responsible for the firm's debt beyond that, with your personal assets. If you run your own private firm and you go bankrupt and you have no enough money, you cannot cover your costs from existing revenue, from the sale of your assets, you have to sell your own house, your own cars. There's an unlimited liability for the firm's debt. So why is that an advantage for a corporation? Yeah, it's far less risky. So if you have $10,000 in savings, and you're thinking between starting up your small new company and investing in a well-established corporation, you will be, in most situations, much more likely to buy shares, stocks in the corporation, because the risk for your money is far lower. So it shouldn't shock you then that 90 to 95% of economic value is, in modern society, is being created by corporations, because they have these competitive advantages over the private firms in the form of the access to the capital market and the limited liability. They have a better way, or they have better mechanisms for attracting savings. and increasing their investment. That's why they grow much bigger in size than private firms. So see, this was a legal innovation, essentially. American legal innovation, by and large. So corporations were not invented in America. See, this is a typical American thing. Somebody discovers something, but they don't know how to use it exactly, and then Americans take it over and improve it and perfect it. Like industrial designs. So corporation, you know who invented corporations? European kings. First corporations were monopolistic grants of privilege by European kings. Hudson Bay Company in England, or East Indies Company. So there are groups of people pulling together their capital who were given a monopoly to perform a certain kind of trade or certain kind of business. To trade in fur with Indians, Hudson Bay Company. If you and me try to set up our company to trade with Indians, we would end up in jail. If you try to deal in spices, the East Indies Company was the only one, we would end up in jail. So that's why sometimes, the socialists say, corporations are evil. Corporations are bad. If you don't believe me, read Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the guy who, the founding father of free market economics. He also hated corporations. So, ergo, every reasonable person should hate corporations because they're evil, and even the most important free market economists believe that. But what they miss here is that Adam Smith didn't hate the corporate form of the firm. He hated the monopolistic character of early corporations. What he wanted to abolish was that the corporations were limited to only one that was given a monopolistic privilege by the king. In America, American innovation was actually to abolish this monopolistic privilege, to say everybody can set up their corporations. Everybody can incorporate. There are no limitations. Business just flourished in the 19th century, especially. From the 19th century onwards. So in a sense, you see how a legal innovation can have a powerful competitive consequences. So the invention or the adjustment of the already existing form of corporation in America created a completely new economic landscape. If you want to be an efficient firm that produces stuff, it's very likely that you're going to adopt a corporate structure, corporate charter, because otherwise you couldn't keep up with your competition because they're going to outraise the money. They're going to have more money than you. You cannot compete. More capital-intensive industry, more expensive industry, more capital is necessary to invest, more likely you are to adopt a corporate form of the firm. Of course, that doesn't mean there is no resistance to this. You have in France and Italy, you have wine producers who are very wealthy people, but who resist going public because they transmit the recipes for wine from father to son, from grandfather to father to son, and so on. They're very jealous of their entity, so they remain private. But these are exceptions. The pressure is growing. Many of them are going public. So the market doesn't care. It's one completely accidental invention that Americans in their pro-freedom attitude made profoundly changed the world. Not only in America, but all across the globe. Everybody said, you have now multinational corporations, Japanese, Chinese, English, European, American, South American, and so on. All of them are corporations. So see, that's also creative destruction. Now, private firm or partnership or proprietorship are by and large on their way out. They create 5% of economic value right now. 100 years ago, they created 70%. It's a creative destruction. Corporation displaces gradually non-corporate types of firm. So see, there are many areas in which you can find these kinds of revolutionary changes, and they are quantitatively way more important for how we live and what we see in the real world and how economic processes are unfolding than just mere price taker and price searcher competition. competition that the textbooks talk about. So that's the main point of Schumpeter's. Are there any final questions, comments? So please do read this short chapter. It's just six pages and very clearly written. So there shouldn't be any problems.